Welcome to session 137 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started the series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 17th of May. Today we'll be looking at Habakkuk 1 to 3 and Psalm 132. But first of all, let's get an overview of Habakkuk. What makes Habakkuk so unique is the fact that it's not a collection of poems and sermons aimed at a particular group. Instead, Habakkuk is a conversation had between the prophet and God, as Habakkuk wrestles through why there's so much wickedness in the world around them. Habakkuk was a prophet in the last years of Judah before their exile by Babylon. Here's a summary of their structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. First of all, we have Habakkuk 1 to 2 verse 5, questions and answers with God. Then we have Habakkuk 2 verses 6 to 20, the 5 woes, and then Habakkuk 3, Habakkuk's prayer. Much of Habakkuk's poems are structured as lament as he wrestles with the wickedness he sees. This becomes an invitation to us to also wrestle with these questions. It serves as a model to every generation of how to wrestle in the face of wickedness and oppression. We complain, we question, we ask God to do something, and then we declare trust that God is in control. So let's jump in with today's reading, Habakkuk 1 to 3. The book opens with Habakkuk making a complaint to God. How long? We see this phrase appear a lot in the Psalms, and this style of writing is called lament. It involves bringing your troubles and feelings to God, pointing them out and mourning them, and then turning from that place to trust in God. Here, Habakkuk is asking God, how long will this wickedness last? This is a violent sin and destruction all around. No one follows the law, the Torah anymore. There is injustice and the leaders are corrupt, perverting justice for their own gain. And God's response? Don't worry. I'm sending the Chaldeans, this is another name for the Babylonians. They will destroy the people and take them into exile so their wickedness will no longer pollute the land. But then Habakkuk responds with a new complaint. Okay, God, so you've chosen the Babylonians to be your tool for judgment against the wickedness in our people. One problem, the Babylonians are even worse. If we were to see the earth like one big sea and all the people in it like fish, the Babylonians are like a fisherman that catches all the fish in his nets, sacrifices them to his foreign gods, and then dumps the dead fish back into the sea so he can catch more. Habakkuk declares that he is like a watchman keeping watch, waiting for God to answer him. And so God responds to Habakkuk again, and this time encourages him to have faith. The things that God is about to describe may not seem like they will happen, but they will. Behold, his soul is puffed up, it's not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. It's Habakkuk 2 verse 4. God's message, or maybe not hugely clear, is simple. The righteous will live by faith. So the contrast is that those who are proud and wicked will die. God's reassuring Habakkuk that there will come a day when all wickedness will be removed from the earth, while the righteous will live. God then makes a series of accusations against Babylon. He calls them out for their violence and plundering, declaring that eventually the nations will come and plunder them. He rebukes those who had built magnificent houses and amassed substantial wealth for themselves, so they wouldn't have to deal with the common people. God will rebuke them for their pride and arrogance. He challenges the nation for using slave labour to build their cities. God shames the people for their love of alcohol and sex, and then mocks those who make and put their trust in idols. In the midst of these accusations, we get a couple of verses that speak of a future hope. Have a look at Habakkuk 2 verse 14 and verse 20. That one day all nations will come to know God and submit to him. Habakkuk then tells God that he remembers the story of God moving powerfully in Israel's history and asks God to do it again, to have mercy on his people and remember them in his wrath. We then get a powerful description of what it will be like when God does show up. The passage describes God in mighty power, with the land trembling and the seas and rivers drying up before him. Even the sun and moon stand still. He comes to bring salvation for his people and to destroy the wicked. We then turn back to Habakkuk, who trembles and recognises how weak he feels in face of all of the wickedness around him and the surrounding destruction. But he commits himself to quietly wait. That's Habakkuk 3 verse 16. Faced with all of this, he will still trust in God. And so Habakkuk ends with praise. Even if all the good fails in Habakkuk's life, there's no food and his people are cut off like sheep, he will still rejoice in God. He will live by faith. And so, like Habakkuk, we are free to bring God our complaints. We can tell him we're scared or hurt by what we see around us, But like Habakkuk, we need to use that to recognize our need for God and place our trust in Him. That even though it may not look like it at the moment, God will make it all right in the end. Eventually, wickedness will consume itself, and all nations will once again serve God. That is Habakkuk. Now let's look at Psalm 132. This psalm isn't attributed to anyone in particular and is named as a psalm of ascent. These psalms were sung by worshippers as they ascended to Jerusalem for the 3 pilgrimage festivals: Passover, Festivals a Week, and the Festival of Tabernacles, or possibly by the Levites as they ascended the steps of the temple. Psalms 120 all the way through to Psalm 134 are all psalms of ascent. Here's a summary of the structure of Psalm 132. We have verses 1 to 10 asking God to continue to dwell amongst his people, and then verses 11 to 18 God's commitment to David and his people. In this ascent journey, we've gone from being far from God's presence in Psalm 120 to seeking God's presence in Psalm 121 and then reaching God's presence in Psalm 122. From there, the psalmist has asked the Lord for help in Psalm 123 and then praised the Lord for his protection in Psalm 124. From within Jerusalem, they reflected on the nature of righteousness and wickedness in Psalm 125. They thanked God for how he has restored his city, but also asked for more in Psalm 126. This led the psalmist to reflect on the importance of God being first and foremost in our lives in Psalm 127 and the importance of fearing God in Psalm 128. Having focused on God's authority and power, the psalmist then reflected on how God rescued them and Israel from oppression in Psalm 129. Then the psalmist called out to God to rescue them from and forgive them for their sins in Psalm 130 and place their trust in the Lord in Psalm 131. Being in Jerusalem, the psalmist then takes a moment to reflect on God's covenant with David. The psalmist starts by asking the Lord to remember David. David had made a commitment before God that his priority was to find God a dwelling place among his people. David was determined to make a temple for God in Jerusalem. Even in Ephrathah, another name for Bethlehem, they'd heard about it and knew to go up to Jerusalem to worship the Lord. So the psalmist asked the Lord to remain faithful to David and to let his presence dwell in that temple. Let this be a place where his priests can intercede and his people can meet with him. Don't turn your back on David and his line after all these years. And so the psalmist focuses on the Lord's commitment to David and his line. The Lord promised that as long as they are faithful, one of David's line will always reign, and the Lord's presence will dwell in Jerusalem. And then, because he dwells in Jerusalem, he will bless its people. He will provide for them. He will give them salvation and cause them to rejoice. The Lord will sustain and establish David's throne and defeat all their enemies. For this psalmist, the Lord's presence is closely linked with the royal line. The Lord's commitment to rise up a faithful king is part of his promise to dwell with his people. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.